Hello, and welcome to Depth Insights, where we take a depth psychological look at news, topics, and events going on in your world. I'm your host, Bonnie Bright, and I'm also the founder of Depth Psychology Alliance, which is an online community for everyone who's interested in the fields of depth and Jungian psychology. And my guest today is Elizabeth Clark Stern, who is a psychotherapist in private practice in Seattle, Washington. Elizabeth has written a pretty fascinating book, which is going to be our featured book for the free online book club on Depth Psychology Alliance for the month of September. Elizabeth's book, Out of the Shadows, A Story of Toni Wolff and Emma Jung, was actually written as a play, and it gives the reader an opportunity to not only envision this unfolding story between Toni Wolff, who was initially a patient of Jung's, as many in the depth psychology community know, but also was his confidant, and I guess I'll let Elizabeth say more about that as it unfolds, but there was a really remarkable triangular relationship between Toni Wolff, Carl Jung, and Emma Jung, which unfolded over the course of many decades, as you will discover as you begin to read this book. And it gives you the opportunity to really envision this in a much more dramatic kind of medium by reading it as a play. So, Elizabeth, thank you so much for being with me today. I can't wait to hear more about what you're going to share with us about the book. Welcome to Depth Insights Radio.
Well, thank you. It's a real thrill to be here, and I'm so excited about your project and your book club. It's been so wonderful following everything you've done so far, so I'm very excited to be part of this.
Well, thank you for being with me. It's really great to have you. This is a very unusual book, and we haven't really had anything quite like it on the book club yet. And so I'm really looking forward to being able to read it along with you and share some of the insights that you've gained as you wrote this and did your research. First of all, maybe you can start by sharing a little bit about the relationship between Toni Wolff and Carl Jung and, of course, his wife, Emma Jung, because not everyone who will be listening to this will necessarily know of that, though for many of us who are involved in the depth psychology community, it's actually something that is quite fundamental in Carl Jung's life and that is profound to depth psychology in general because of the contributions of both of these remarkable women.
Well, exactly. And it began in 1910. It goes that far back. Toni Wolff, her father had just died. I think that's a significant piece. She was 22 years old and went into analysis with Carl Jung, and in the play, she meets Emma on the eve of this in the garden while she's waiting to go in and see her husband for the first time. Emma Jung is only 26, but she's already got 4 children and has a very different life. But I was so inspired to write this because both of these women were so curious, so passionate, and so young. And the play really is about the unfolding of their friendship, their relationship over time, and how, in a way, Carl Jung, because he was involved with Toni for many, many years, first as her analyst, then she became sort of his secretary, his collaborator, his go-to woman who would run to the library and get any book he wanted as he began to develop depth psychology. And she was there. And then when he had his break with Freud, she became his analyst and got him through that whole period with the Red Book. And Emma had always wanted to play that role in his life. She had always wanted to be trained by him and to become, his muse. Well, Toni became his muse and ultimately his lover and remained so. And he was very open about all this, told his wife, no, I need this woman in my life. And somehow these women had to navigate this relationship. And in the play, Jung is actually not a character in it, although at one time we did write him in and tried that, and it was too hard to embody him when we wanted to really center it on their relationship. But he's off stage, he's out in the audience, he's right there in an empty chair. Talk about empty chair work. Emma, reams him out all the time in there. He's a vacant present. But in many ways, he is a very central character to this, and you get to experience Jung as he was seen by each of these women. They saw him so differently, and their relationship and their view of him changed over time. So that's some background in it. It's a very racy tale in many ways, this triangulated relationship. But the two women knew each other through all of this, and I really wanted to capture that in this play.
Yes, and I should mention here, actually, which I don't think I did when we first introduced your work, and that is that you have worked for many years as both an actor and a professional screenwriter. And this play actually has been produced in a number of locations. I know it's been produced in Seattle and at the International Jungian Congress in South Africa. And was it also produced in New Orleans as well?
Oh, yes. Oh, my goodness. That was such a thrilling production. The Archetypal Theater Company in New Orleans paired up with the Jung Society, and we had a fantastic performance in New Orleans. And there are two Jungian analysts who are not myself and my colleague, but who are now performing it in, oh, goodness, I think they just did it in Atlanta and have done it in Birmingham and Colorado. And so we're just thrilled to death. And I'm actually hoping that people that read this and get inspired by it could mount their own readings in their own communities. That would be, it's not that hard. It's two women, on a pretty bare stage. And that, I think, is something that I would offer to anybody out there that wants to do it. Just go for it.
Excellent. I love that idea. I think it's a very rich idea. And, the story is so juicy. As you said, it's kind of racy, but it's also real life. And the two characters that are central to this are just such powerful women in their own ways. And, of course, times were very different then, and both of them were denied a university education, and I think they were very smart women, and yet not having that kind of validation to be able to actually sort of be in the world in that way. I mean, for me, it's hard to understand because I really, truly love, my own opportunity for education, and I also look at these two women who not only were they having to struggle with that aspect of their lives, but when you look at Emma as being such a young mother to so many young lives, I mean, she must have had them very close together in her life. And then to be introduced to each other and realize that on some level they were vying for the attention of the same man all the time, I can't even imagine how difficult this whole situation must have been. And, of course, to have it in the open, I suppose, was the only alternative if Jung really wanted to hang on to both of them. And it's pretty clear to me that he got something different from each of them, and that probably seems obvious, but I wonder, Elizabeth, if you could talk a little bit about the archetypal themes that are kind of underlying this, because clearly there are certain archetypes at work both in each woman and also in the relationships between the two of them and then also the three of them.
Absolutely. And actually, my model for thinking about this was Toni Wolff's own work. She wrote really just a pamphlet, not a book, called Structural Forms of the Feminine Psyche. And in it she posits four major feminine archetypes: the mother and the hetaria meaning courtesan, lover, nourisher of the man, which is kind of an ancient concept if you think about it, and I kind of like to think of a modern way of thinking of the hetaria is that we would have a relationship with our own animus and nourish our own creativity, not necessarily in a man. I mean, I guess you could think of the early Hillary Clinton before she became the major player that she is on the world stage. When she was First Lady, she was in a hetaria position as well as being a mother. And the other two feminine archetypes are the Amazon and the medial woman meaning one who mediates between heaven and earth. And actually, I'm writing a new play. I've written a new play that's going to be done in Copenhagen in 2013 at the International Congress, which is about the archetypal Amazon and medial woman. And that's all. I'll just throw that in. And that is coming from this work in many ways. But Emma, for Jung, was this maternal figure. I mean, good heavens, there was one of the things they discussed, frankly, is that birth control was available, but Emma didn't use it because he didn't want her to, and so she just kept having these children, and that's the way that the conventional wisdom was at the time. And she sort of anchored him in the world, and he needed her desperately to be his wife, to be his not only that, but his provider, because she was very wealthy, and he was able to do all that he did in psychology and build all of this because he was not having to get out and make a living, which I think is a fascinating aspect of all this. Toni Wolff also came from a great deal of wealth and lived at home with her mother during all this time that she was, skipping off and going to Jung's and doing all this work with him, she would come home in the evening and have to set the dinner table and preside and play a very conventional role. But for Jung, Toni was his muse. She was the woman that fired his intellect, his passion. She played a very, very different part in his development. She was responsible in many ways for some of his theories, including the theory of psychological types. There's a great deal of evidence that she came up with that. So he relied on her intellect, and she was his hetaria. Emma was his mother, his wife, and the woman who anchored him in the world. But she was very angry, frankly, in many ways, that he limited her in that regard. Mm-hmm. But she finally did become her own analyst, and that was a triumph for Emma.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, actually, that you bring up. Well, two of them. I mean, first of all, it's hard to ignore the part about being angry, because when I look at it from a certain standpoint, how could she not have been? It must have been very difficult for her to be in that position of having to be the caretaker and probably viewing Toni, her rival in so many ways, as being the one who was free of that, not having to care for, the children and not having to take care of all the household kinds of tasks. At the same time, you might look at Toni and wonder if she didn't sort of envy the maternal aspects or perhaps having the children and having that kind of anchoring to Jung. But what's interesting about all of that, actually, is that both of the women had aspirations in the field of psychology. And I wonder how much of that was due just to, projection and to Jung's own influence on them. But they both actually wanted to be analysts and ended up being, just as you mentioned.
Well, and I think that also speaks to the limited options they had at the time. As you mentioned, it was not typical for them to go to university. Toni was sent off to a finishing school in her earliest years before the play started, because she was supposed to be groomed in, how to pour tea and all this and be a good wife, and she was appalled by that. She wanted to read Nietzsche. She wanted to have a vibrant intellectual life. And without being able to be a university professor, I mean, what else were you going to do with your intellect but become an analyst? And she was so fascinated with psychology. And, of course, Emma was very jealous of that. But one of my very favorite scenes in the play is a scene where Emma is pregnant with her fifth child, during the very time that Jung is going through his turmoil and writing the Red Book, and the two women meet in the garden when Toni's been working with Jung for hours and hours and hours, and says, oh, he's asleep at last. And there's a moment where she looks at Emma and goes, you're going to have a child, another child. How do you feel about that? And you sense Toni's longing for that. Toni feeling that is one thing she, by saying she's never going to get married, that she is devoting herself to this intellectual life. She is giving up that role as a mother. And, I think all women, in a way, at some point in their lives want to be all of the different archetypes. And we can't all be. Mm-hmm. And there's a sense of loss in that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really powerful. I think the way that you have managed to get into this web of richness under each of these characters is really profound, and you've tapped into something that everybody can relate to, not just women, but also the men who also, I'm sure, on some level, want to tap into each one of those archetypes as well. Probably, I guess we could talk about it in the sense of their own anima. I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about the animus and anima and how the way that you're sort of looking at it can be applicable to each of us today.
Well, and I'm so glad you brought that up about men, because I've been amazed at how many men not only come to the play, but come up to me afterwards and are just so excited by this, because I think it's a portrayal of the feminine that they can apply to their own lives. Absolutely. And that Jung, I mean, one of the things that comes through about Jung is how much they both loved him in spite of all of his dark sides, and boy, that gets portrayed, his flaws. But I think there was a big black guy in New Orleans who came up and just hugged me so tight and said, I didn't know anything about this when I came into this play, but I got to tell you, there wasn't one false note. I just loved it. It was so wonderful. And I think the animus for a woman is so critical because that is archetypally the creative drive. And you could call it an anima in a man. I don't think it's about gender. I think both men and women, regardless of what their physical presentation is, need both the loving part, the feminine part, if you will, the receptive part, the listening part of their psyche, and they need this vibrant inner creative drive that is so connected to the deep self. And in Emma and Toni, the first act takes place when they're in their 20s. The second act of the play, there's a 16-year gap. And in those 16 years, both of them are now analysts. Toni has become, world-traveled with Jung, and they have a very solid collegial relationship. But both women talk at the beginning of the second act about their relationship with their inner animus. And how when you really begin to envision it, and you have dreams often of having sex with your animus, that is what Jung would call the conjunctio. That is the bringing together of the masculine and the feminine in the deep psyche. And then that lives in you, and that informs all of your choices. And it changes your relationship with the exterior men in your life. In the case of Emma and Toni, they joke about how Emma starts writing her book, Animus and Anima, and she starts saying to Jung, well, I don't want to go play pool with you tonight. I have to write. I have a priority. And it shifts everything for them. And also, of course, informs their connection as women, because then they are allied with something that is larger than themselves, but a deep, deep part of themselves. Mm-hmm. And I think the concept of anima and animus are so critical today, when I think there's still so many pulls to enmesh yourself with your lover, enmesh yourself with your husband, give over yourself, your duties, or whatever it is. If you're a man as a breadwinner, if you're a woman now as a breadwinner, or nurturing your children, you have to be able to return again and again to that vibrant thing inside of you that lives as the animus or the anima.
Yes, that's very well put, and I can completely see how vital it is for each of us to be able to tap into that, and to be able to see this playing out in front of us is a really great example of really just development of the soul, of the self, the biggest self, as Jung referred to it. There's a really, really great, for everybody who's listening, there's a great review that's been done of the book, which, again, is called Out of the Shadows. And this was done by Sue Rosenthal, and it's posted actually on Depth Insights in the book section. You can find it at depthinsights.com, and just click on the book club and go to the month of September, and you'll be able to scroll down the page. You can read all about the book and about Elizabeth, and then just scroll down the page, and Sue Rosenthal's book review is posted there. And she does a really great job of really describing what's going on in the book, giving a good synopsis of it, and also a really great analysis, I think, of the whole unfolding of the story. And one thing that she points out, which I love, and it may be obvious to everybody, but it was not necessarily to me until I started thinking about it, was that the title of the book, Out of the Shadows, is kind of referring to how each woman steps out of the shadows, the projection, the shadow projection of both the other woman on her, and also, I'm sure, of Jung's projection on each of the women as well, and really comes into their own and develops their own persona and their own self, and begins to take on that mantle of something bigger in their lives, just as you mentioned. So I encourage everybody to go to the website, depthinsights.com, and click on the book club and read that review. And that brings us to another point, actually, Elizabeth, which I'm really excited about talking to you about, and that is, we know that this is based on history. There's a lot of factual stuff that we've been talking about here, and both women, of course, have done writings that are somewhat accessible. I know Toni Wolff's writings have not really been widely published, and I've heard there's some talk that they're going to be. So I hope that's going to happen soon, other than this paper that you mentioned where she refers to the different archetypes. But maybe you can talk to us a little bit about your own process, because I know that there's, of course, being it's a play and we don't have all of the details, you've been able to take some creative license with this and develop these characters and develop the story in ways that are quite dramatic and absolutely fascinating and so rich. Can you talk to us about your own creative process in writing the play and how it might be relevant to other ways of being creative and other forms of creative media?
Well, yes, I think in essence I just kind of gave myself over to my own curiosity about all this, and in the research phase just read everything I could. This actually began years ago when I was in graduate school, and I wrote the first draft of it with another woman. We would do improvisations on it, and there was very little written back then about both of the women and what they actually went through. And so we were really kind of moles in the dark in those times. The Deirdre Bair biography of Jung, when it came out, I just went nuts because it had whole chapters on Emma, on Toni Wolff. There was a whole chapter. Toni had her own chapter. And so it just made so much come alive in my imagination. I mean, it was really like the food of the soul. I would just devour it and read it over and over again. And little tiny details would come through as I would sit down and write, because my analyst always says, oh, you're just taking dictation from the unconscious. And that, I swear to goodness, is what it feels like when you really have immersed yourself in the lives of your characters. You just have to turn it on and show up. I think Woody Allen always says, well, I just show up and turn on the typewriter and there it goes. And I think part of it is trusting that part of yourself, trusting that everything you've read, like, for example, I read in the Deirdre Bair biography that Emma read Anna Karenina and didn't care for it. And then later I'm writing a scene where Emma's with a bit of jealousy saying, well, I hear you're a story writer. And because Toni Wolff was. She wrote her own short stories, and at one point Jung thought she should become a writer, and Toni says yes, well, and she's despairing of her poetry or something. And Emma says, oh, well, I attempted Anna Karenina. That was enough. It was too long a book. But then guess who shows up later as her animus in her dream? She walks through the door, and there's Tolstoy saying, you didn't like Anna Karenina. But he shows up when she is writing Animus and Anima, and it becomes just this delightful moment in the play. It's one of my favorite moments. I'm giving it away here, but that just came out unbidden, out of my little psyche, and from the fact that I had read it in the biography. And I think that's the great joy of creative work. And for anyone out there, I would say, using memoir, whether it's memoir, whether you're writing your own story, I think my own little psyche, my own life came through, my own personality. People who knew me well just giggled all over the place and said, oh, it's you all over. And I said, what? I thought I was writing about these other women, but it happens. And it can be redemptive, it can be healing, somehow fictionalizing things and opening to different creative possibilities, because as you said, you have to flesh this out. You have to imagine what they would have said to one another. But I just think imagination is the aqueduct to the soul, and the more that I would encourage everyone out there to do their own creative work and just listen to the unconscious, trust it, let it go.
Excellent advice. Did you, in the process, also engage with active imagination with the characters to complete the play?
Well, I would think the whole play is an active imagination. I really would call it that. I did, sometimes I wrote pieces about, like I would go into Toni and just start writing about her and what she felt, and she would tell me, go this way, go that way. No, I didn't feel this. No, I didn't feel that. So I would sort of call those little biographies that I would write from each of their points of view, because they would write it to me from the first person, and I would interview them sometimes. I guess that is very much a tool of active imagination. I would say, well, Toni, what did you feel when Jung said, I'm more interested now in Marie-Louise von Franz and her thoughts. And boy, did she tell me. And then I would use some of those excerpts in the dialogue itself. So, yes, active imagination is a wonderful tool.
Well, it's great to hear a little bit about your process. I meant to mention, actually, for our listeners, you referred to this biography from Deirdre Baer a couple of times, and you can Google that, of course. It's called Jung, a Biography. So it's pretty simple, but anybody who's interested in reading that might want to look that up and find it. And Deirdre Baer, her last name is spelled B-A-I-R. So I'm looking actually at the timeline over which the story takes place, Elizabeth. And as you mentioned, it begins in 1910 when Emma was just 26, and of course Toni was just 22. I mean, so young. I look at people in their 20s these days, and I just think, how did any of us know anything at that age? And yet here they all were, just so embroiled in their lives and what was going on with them. And it spans the course of 40 years. So but those 40 years were a long time ago. They were the first half of the 20th century, and of course our culture and our society has come so far since then, and even depth psychology and Jungian psychology have progressed. I'm wondering if you have an idea about how the story, even though it took place back then, is relevant to us, because clearly there are some elements that are just so powerful in there. Can you share with us about that?
Well, I wish things had changed that much, but I think there are certain, if you want to look at it from a feminist point of view, I mean, my goodness, look across the world now, and we have such access now to what's happening in the Middle East, and there's still so much oppression of women all throughout Africa, and in our own country. Good heavens, there is still such a glass ceiling. And I think the fact that, yes, these women now, most of them, certainly in this country and in most of the developed world, can go to university, and there are more women now studying to be doctors than men. And those things are very promising. But I think on the archetypal level, there's still an oppression factor of the feminine. And one of the things that I'm so interested in is the archetypal power of the feminine as she is expressed in men, in women, in all of the different political movements and subtle things that are happening in the world today. And I think this play really speaks to that. It uses circumstances of the early 20th century, but there is still a great deal of, I would say, prejudice against the feminine voice, the archetypal voice that says compassion is more important than dominance or power or aggression. And one of the pieces that I love in the play that I stole from James Hillman's book, A Terrible Love of War, if any of you have read that James Hillman book, in it he talks about the myth that when Aphrodite and Ares, the god of love and war, got together and had their affair, all of the gods came down from Olympus and made judgment on this terrible union. They were horrified that love and war would be having a relationship. The women stayed home, saying, oh no, we're too delicate to look upon the carnal scene. And so I think the goddesses are still in hiding in some way in our world today. And damn it, they need to show up. The feminine power needs to exert itself in the world. And that really I'm writing about in almost every scene of the play. I think that is one of my great passions. And I think, yes, I think it's very universal. And I think it's happening. I think there are very positive signs and hopeful signs. But if the more conscious we are that we want to bring these goddesses out of hiding and have them make judgment of we cannot marry love and war. We cannot love our war. We have to have compassion for every person on this planet. And so that's why I think it's very universal.
Yeah. Well, that's really beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. And I so absolutely agree. And, of course, it's very interesting because in the field of Jungian psychology, depth psychology in general, as it was started initially by pioneers like Freud and Jung, who, we consider so masculine or patriarchal in their thinking in a lot of ways. And, of course, a lot of it had to do with the time frame in which they were working and in the ways we were then. But, as you mentioned, not much has changed. And it just makes me think, the book club that we just finished, the featured book was called Marked by Fire, Stories of the Jungian Way, done by Patricia Damry and Naomi Ruth Lewinsky. And Naomi is a poet, and she has a lovely essay at the back of the book. It's the last essay in the book. I just read it. And she talks about an act of imagination that she did with Jung, in which he was nervous or concerned about poetry and her being a poet, and how could she be a Jungian analyst and a poet at the same time. And she does a really beautiful job in that book of looking at Jung, or opening our eyes to Jung as an artist and a poet, and not just this kind of patriarchal, scholarly psychology figure, which is often how I catch myself thinking about him. So it really brought new eyes for me to Jung himself. And, of course, I think it's really critical in the field of depth psychology that we're able to take that perspective and see the feminine in the field, and certainly among the founders who have such a strong presence. I mean, Jung is larger than life, and that's kind of where we started this whole conversation about how he had such an impact on these two women and how they really had to stand up for themselves in the face of it.
Absolutely. I think the feminine is so alive in Jung. I think that's why women love him so much. And why, I remember being 23 years old and reading Memories, Dreams, and Reflections and just going crazy, going, oh, my God, and Man and His Symbols. And there was something in it that just spoke to the depth of poetry in all of us. And I think, Jung himself was very, very much in touch with his anima and these women that reflected it in his life. And I think that's why so many Jungian analysts are also poets or writers or artists or painters. I know in our local Jungian community, so many of us just find the arts absolutely essential to our souls. And I think that comes very much from living the archetype. And we do have Jung to thank for that.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Well, I'm with you there. I think the more that we can invite the goddesses in, the better off we're all going to be, both individually and as a collective, for sure. Well, I've been talking with Elizabeth Clark Stern, who is a psychotherapist and also the author of Out of the Shadows, a story of Toni Wolff and Emma Jung, which is our featured selection for the free online Depth Psych book club on Depth Psychology Alliance for the month of September 2012. And Elizabeth, thank you so much for being with me. You can find out more about Elizabeth at both of her websites. One is her blog, which is elizabethclarkstern.com/WordPress, or you can Google Elizabeth Clark Stern. And also she has a website at www.soulstories.net. And if you're interested in the online book club, you can find more information, as I mentioned, at depthinsights.com. And just click on the book club link there and go to the month of September, and you'll see more about the book. Again, there's that wonderful book review by Sue Rosenthal that I mentioned, and you can see more about Elizabeth as well. There's actually a link to her website there, and you can also order the book from there too. So I invite everybody to go to depthinsights.com to find out more, and then if you'd like to join, you can go to depthpsychologyalliance.com. And if you're not a member already, it's also free to join, and there's a pretty remarkable community of people who are members there. We have about 1,500 members now from all over the world, and so there's all kinds of discussions, blogs, videos, events, everything that you can imagine and would want to encounter in the depth psychology world. I think you can pretty much find there. So I invite everybody to come participate in that. And again, Elizabeth, thank you so much for spending your time with me. The book sounds fabulous. I can't wait to read it.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. It was a great joy.